hello, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny, and I'm hoping to release a video in about a week's time, hopefully, where I talk about my knitting plans for the year, informally. I'm not very good at seasonal knitting plans. It's kind of like what I plan to knit for the foreseeable future, and this year for me that's really going to be based on what I have in stash. And I'm doing that for, in my life, very particular personal reasons that I'll talk about a bit in a few minutes. But it's also just been getting me to think more generally about questions of stash and you know, the questions that go around the knitting community periodically about how big our stashes are, how big our stashes should be, you know, whether we should try to keep things going out as much as they're coming in, and the ways that just, you know, even our anti-capitalist, making things, slow making handicrafts art form still dovetails with capitalism and consumerism because of the world that we live in 2026. So I'm hoping tonight, it's really only about 4 p.m., but it's already dark, so I'm hoping this afternoon, this evening, to kind of talk through some of these ideas a bit informally. As I mentioned, there's kind of, you know, some acute circumstances in my life that have had me thinking about this in a very specific way, but in that way that, you know, you learn a new word on the radio and then, or you learn a new word and then you hear it on the radio and then a friend uses it and then you hear someone on the street use it. Because I've been thinking about these ideas a bit more explicitly, a bit more consciously than usual, I guess. I feel like I've also just encountered more ideas from other people lately and had some interesting conversations. And so I thought I'd share all of that with you too. And I'm hoping to knit. I'm hoping this will be a knit and chat. And we'll see how the breathlessness goes and everything like that. So I do have a knitting project with me that I will show you, but I have spent most of the afternoon. We're having a gorgeous snowy day here in the beautiful northeast of England. I'm so excited. I don't think I'm the only person who's very excited. There have been lots of families with small children walking by, tugging toboggans, so I think people have been going tobogganing on hills around us. There isn't very much snow, you know, there's very little snow, but people are taking advantage of it. And my Canadian heart has been very, very, very happy. And I have just been sitting here looking out the window all afternoon at the beautiful snow in our back garden. And I've had the cats with me most of the afternoon. They're zooming around now, but they may or may not make an appearance. So I've got some footage of knitting from this afternoon where the colors are obviously a bit better because of natural light, and where, you know, where you can really see me knitting. So if I struggle to both knit and talk, I'll splice some of that bee footage over top, but we'll see how we go. But to show you what I'm intending to knit on, and hopefully we'll be knitting on, this is the Sorgenfri shawl or neckerchief by Guri Pedersen. Oh, and that's actually the back that I'm showing you. It does make a huge difference. They're very similar, and I think the back looks nice. But this is the front, and this is a free pattern, and I'm just loving it. I'm really, really enjoying knitting on this. And I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased actually that I decided to knit on it and, you know, talk about it with you, because it made me look up the pronunciation of the title. And I'm sure I'm not getting the pronunciation exactly correct, so apologies for that. But in looking up the title, I learned that it means kind of like carefree or worry-free. So it kind of translates to the carefree or worry-free shawl, and that's making me love it even more because it is definitely serving a kind of carefree purpose for me. Oh, the moon is coming up and it looks amazing. A big full moon. And it's just been a really carefree, happy knit. It's lots of just, you know, knit rows and some ribbing, not too many complicated increases or anything like that. So I do have to glance at, I've got some notes about the pattern. I have to glance at that occasionally, but for the most part, it's really just pretty straightforward knitting. And, oh, before I forget, and I am knitting it with, I'll definitely put in some footage of just this yarn in better lighting and with a better angle and that kind of stuff, because the yarn is just gorgeous. So this is undyed 4-ply from a yarn from North Ronaldsay, and I won't talk about, I brought the ball band because it's so special, this yarn, but I won't talk about the story behind this yarn or where this yarn comes from too much now. I'll save that for a podcast where I'm talking about what I'm working on more explicitly, more directly, So that is to come, because there's a really great story behind this yarn, and it's like rustic and thick and thin, and I just love it. It's really like, it's not a perfect yarn by any means, but it's a favorite of mine, I think. This is the first time I'm working with it, but oh my gosh, it's a favorite. It's so gorgeous. So I will definitely share that with you, but just so that you know what I'm working on and working with, that's what I've got on the go, and that's what I'm hoping we'll talk about. So I guess that one of the places to start this conversation, or one of the places that we could start this conversation, is with me talking about kind of what my usual position on these kinds of questions is, because I think we're all always coming from different perspectives and different anxieties and different neuroses when we're having these kinds of conversations. I definitely come from a fairly non-religious but culturally quite puritanical background, and this is not something that my family was very conscious of until quite recently, and partially with my illness. We've been having more and more conversations about how lots of our kind of fundamental biases as a family go against the kind of like rest and really just rest that I need, right? Like, I come from quite a like, owning too many things is bad, and working hard is good, and, you know, not complaining is good, and that, you know, that those are kind of fundamental principles that back up my inherited worldview. And so for me, lots of my anxiety when it comes to knitting actually has less to do with stash and more just to do with the fact that I am, I guess, primarily a sweater knitter. That's what I knit the most. That's what tends to not give me the most joy, but that tends to be the kind of project that I'm most excited to cast on. Not necessarily the project that you know, some of my shawls are my favorite finished objects, but for whatever reason, sweaters give me a lot of joy, and I get really excited about knitting them and really excited about the idea of wearing them and that kind of thing. And this anxiety has definitely predated my illness, but I think it's become more acute over the last several years, really, as I've been going out less and less and needing to stay home and be quite sedentary more and more. I've developed more and more of an anxiety about owning too many sweaters, which I think to me is, you know, really just kind of a one-to-one correlation of anxiety about Beatty, which is really just to me a one-to-one correlation of, you know, feeling like myself and my husband and you guys and, you know, friends when I video call them are really the only people who see my sweaters, and so it feels silly to own too many of them. I don't really need very many sweaters. I don't really need very many hats. And so my usual impulse with knitting and thinking about stash and thinking about my knitting practice alongside, or how it fits into my values and ethics and the way that I see the world and the way that I think we should be behaving ourselves in the world, moving through the world, is to try to slow myself down. I always want to be able to be knitting. I want to have as much time to knit as I can. So for me, it's often a question of being slow, picking projects that are going to take me quite a bit of time so that I get maximum enjoyment and don't end up with too many finished objects. That's the way that my anxiety typically bends, I think. And my neuroses typically bends. Now, I feel like it's really important for me to mention that this is something I tie myself in knots about and have feelings about. I never apply that thinking to anyone else. And in fact, that's something that my mother, my mom, has kind of pointed out to me, that like I can tie myself into knots and get really fixated on something that when I apply to anyone else, I can see it's ridiculous too, you know? And so that is something that I have used occasionally to you know, unlock myself from that circular thinking. This is silly. I don't feel this way about anyone else, you know? People who have way more sweaters than me, there's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with that except when I apply it to myself. And so there's definitely, you know, an element of just circular thinking, some anxiety, you know, all that leftover stuff that lots of us have from the pandemic. I think lots of that's involved in this. But that's definitely where I'm coming from as a kind of default position. But this past year has really turned that anxiety on its head. And so if you haven't watched my previous video, or you're new here, I have a number of chronic illnesses and disabilities that intersect and are comorbidities of one another, and I've had them all my life, which I did not know, but they've become much more acute over the last several years. And then unfortunately I had a really big crash in kind of late January, early February last year, and became more or less bedbound until, well, for about 10 or 11 months. And this is not the first time that I had to stop knitting. I wasn't able to knit for a long chunk of that time, and it's not the first time that I've had to stop knitting, but it's the longest period that I've had to stop knitting, and it's the most severe that my other symptoms have ever been. And my usual anxiety kicked in regarding my knitting, which is stuff that I haven't knit yet, right? When I'm unable to knit, then who cares how many sweaters I own? Then it becomes, look at this yarn I haven't used. And previously, I hadn't been knitting all that much. The last time I stopped being able to knit, I had just come off my latest bout of being a grad student and didn't have a lot of disposable income for yarn, so I didn't have a lot of stash. But I had some special yarns that I had been kind of saving, that I didn't feel like I was a good enough knitter, or I didn't feel like I'd found the right project to be able to cast on yet. And so the big lesson that I took from the last time that I was unable to knit was to knit the good stuff. And I'm not saying that I learned that lesson fully last time, but that was definitely, if I can crystallize a single lesson that came out of that previous experience, that was it. This time, the anxiety was a bit more generalized. It was really just, knitting has become a much larger part of my life. I have a bit more disposable income than I used to, so I do have more stash than I used to. I'm also more sedentary. I'm not moving around quite as much, so it's, I have accumulated things. I have accumulated things, lots of things, and yarn and a bit of stash is part of that. And my anxiety over this past year really became, and this is my personal situation, but I promise that I am going to relate this to everyone. I think that this is very much part of the broader conversation. But my anxiety really became, what if I can never knit again? And then I have all of this yarn that's just going to sit around making me feel guilty until I give it away or donate it or something like that. And it became really clear at that point that sweaters or shawls or socks or, gifts for other people representing things I had made, time I had spent, joy I had felt knitting, calm that I had received from knitting, at that point really, really would be not better, but certainly not worse than having yarn in stash. And so, excuse me. And so it really turned my thinking on its head, and I was kind of wondering why I'd been so worried about slowing myself down and kind of trying to make sure that I would always have yarn to knit on, which we could talk about, tying into other anxieties about, money and things like that. But slowing myself down and wanting to always have lots of knitting ahead of me doesn't necessarily fit perfectly with where my body is right now, what makes the most sense, and what's gonna, cause me the least anxiety if and when my health dips again. So that was a new way of looking at these kind of recurring questions for me, these kind of older questions for me. And that really has led into my knitting plans for 2026, right? That's my action based on these thoughts, is that I'm going to knit for my stash. I have quite a bit of yarn that is a bigger gauge, and I really do love knitting on a smaller gauge. I just like the needles better. The needles are more comfortable in my hands, but I also feel like those take a bit more time. That has been something that I've really enjoyed. I'm gonna knit some bigger gauge projects. I'm going to not rush through, because I don't believe in that either. Like, the whole point is to enjoy the knitting process and choose projects that are going to challenge me and learn new skills. So, you know, fast is still not the goal. I'm still definitely intending to take things slow, but slow in a natural, enjoyable way for myself, I hope, rather than slow in a conceding to my own intrusive thoughts way. But more generally, it's been making me think about my whole attitude to these things a little bit differently, about my whole attitude to knitting and yarn consumption. And that's where, this is where other people's ideas are really starting to come in for me. And one of those people is Tashi from Stitches and Starlight. And it's early January as I'm filming this, early January 2026. I will hopefully be able to upload it before too long, but just in case, it's early January 2026. And last month I was watching Tashi's Vlogmas videos, and they were doing sit and spins. And in one of those videos, they talk about how, you know, they were really talking about encouraging people to just spin and not worry about being a good enough spinner to use the fiber, and to just get in there and, you know, get their hands dirty and try some things out. And they said that, you know, I mean, it's such a self-evident thing, but they said wool is a renewable resource. And of course wool is a renewable resource. That's why I love it. That's why I use it. That's why it's my preferred fiber. One of many reasons that it's my preferred fiber. But it was one of those situations where hearing it from someone I admire, someone whose opinion on these kinds of things I respect, clicked with me in a different and new way. And it just reminded me that, yeah, you know, I believe in seeking wool out whenever possible from sources where, you know, you can tell that the sheep have been treated well. But as long as the sheep are being treated well, they need to be sheared for their well-being. You know, we need to be collecting that yarn, or not the wool. And if it gets turned into yarn, so much the better. Because otherwise, you know, when the value of wool was way down several years ago, you saw all sorts of stories of UK farmers setting fire to their wool, which isn't easy to do because it's quite flame retardant, but setting fire to it in a kind of symbolic protest of how much it had lost its value. And that value is climbing. So in all sorts of environmental, political, cultural ways, I believe in wool as a renewable resource. I believe in wool as something that we should be supporting and consuming. So that was one thing that really clicked for me. But another was a bit more personalized, and this was, I was speaking to a friend of mine. I respect their opinion immensely on all of these issues. And I was talking to them about the knitting, and they've been getting into cross stitch and some things like that, and we were talking about crafting, and I kind of asked their opinion about consumption and craft supplies and that kind of thing. And they said a lot of really interesting things, you know, about how, you know, they and I both feel very similarly about individuals bearing the brunt of, you know, our individual scorn or criticism for not being perfectly environmentally friendly, even though it's not possible to be in the way that certainly our Western societies are built. You know, not holding individuals responsible for everything when really it's corporations and billionaires that are doing most of the damage. You know, that's certainly something that we agree on. But regarding my personal situation, they also mentioned, and this is one of those things that really, like, it punched me in the gut a bit when they said it. But they said that this is something that they do themselves, that they recognize in themselves, and that they thought, you know, I might be doing. And what that was is, because I am depending on knitting so much right now, because knitting is such a big part of my life and so central to helping to keep me balanced while I face lots of changes and you know, lots of restrictions to my independence and things like that, that knitting is really central to the way I'm getting through my day-to-day life right now. And so maybe I'm finding ways to take it away from myself before someone else or my body can take it away from me. And that I might be over applying my values and my ethics to this very specific part of my life out of fear. And this is one of those statements that has really, really stuck with me, and that seems more significant and more profound the longer I sit with it, because certainly in this conversation with my friend, they were talking specifically about my fear of not being able to knit. Fear of maybe being ill like this and needing knitting in the way that I need knitting now, or, not even being ill, but just being a person in the world in 2026 and needing knitting the way that I know that lots of us need knitting, and finding myself financially unable to buy the kind of fibers that I want to buy, or finding myself, physically unable to knit. So certainly there's that individually tailored fear for me, but it was making me think, or this is making me think, a couple of weeks after that conversation, about other ways that fear manifests in these conversations that we have in the knitting community, and the anxieties that lots of us have. And people who knit and spend lots of their time knitting are people who care about taking things slow and care about the world and care about the environment. And there is no perfect way, and care about other people, care about the well-being of the people in the places our wool is being sourced, the people who are working with the sheep, care about the sheep, care about animal welfare. I think by and large, knitters are those kinds of people. And there is no correct way to do anything to align with those shared values, right? That's going to be different for all of us. Our circumstances, what's accessible to us, is going to be different for everyone. And so it raises, the intersection of these things raise a lot of questions. And they're questions that I think our very disparate knitting community grapples with all the time, and grapples with in, sometimes critical ways, criticizing people who we might see as doing things not the way we think they should, but also in really self-critical ways. In, I'm sure I'm not the only one who ties myself into knots about these kinds of things occasionally. Maybe I'm overstating my neuroses, but I do care about these things, and can definitely feel myself getting a bit restricted, getting a bit tight with my own feelings about what I should do, or my own uncertainty about what I should do, my own uncertainty about what the best way to exist in my hobby, exist through my hobby is. And I think that fear, that dynamic, I should say, is undergirded by fear for lots of us. Fear about health in general. I'm certainly more anxious about health in general, about even just, the odd cold or flu than I used to be before the pandemic. But also anxiety about climate change, about what climate change is doing to different parts of our world, the natural occurrences that are so much more extreme and so much more deadly than they used to be, and the kind of rise of conflict and intolerance, and the kind of, a friend of mine kind of talked about a while ago how she's just shocked by the kind of glee that there is in some of the cruelty that's happening right now. And I'm certainly a bit shocked by the scale of that as well. I think lots of us are, or maybe we shouldn't be shocked. Maybe that's naive. But it certainly feels like the world is a very scary place, and fear is a pretty natural reaction to that right now. And I guess I've been wondering how much that fear might be bleeding into these conversations about whether or not we should use acrylic or natural fibers, you know? And there are arguments on both sides of that line up with my values. You know, I know lots of vegans who don't want to use animal fibers. And so then they're using, you know, cottons, linens, but also acrylics, because acrylics aren't, you know, there's no risk of direct harm. I'm sure in the processing of acrylics, or, you know, there's harm in the processing of everything. But, you know, I know lots of vegans who prefer not to knit with wool or alpaca or yak or anything like that, and are more comfortable knitting with acrylic. All sorts of other people I know are you know, more comfortable knitting with wool and alpaca and yak than with acrylics, because they are renewable fibers in a way that acrylics are not. And acrylics will not biodegrade and will introduce microplastics into the environment, particularly when we wash them. You know, these conversations are not clear cut, and I think that they're so important for us to have. They're so interesting for us to have, but the way, I guess what I'm saying is that I wonder how much the way that we have those conversations, and the way that we have those conversations with ourselves, not just with each other, but with ourselves, is undergirded by this kind of fear and generalized anxiety about the world. You know, and conversations about superwash versus non-superwash, you know, whether people use plastic bags to store their yarn, whether people, you know, get into spinning and buy 6 spinning wheels or stick with just one drop spindle. You know, there's a scale and a question to all of the ways that we decide to engage in our craft, in our art. And every one of those questions can become contentious, and every one of those questions can, and for me does, cause anxiety. You know, I really want to be a person who acts and behaves according to my values. But it's really hard to know how to act in accordance with our own values in a world where everything we do causes harm on some level, and it's just kind of impossible to escape that entirely. Now, for me personally, I don't think that any of these questions or revelations are going to change the way that I'm actually knitting and the way that I plan my knits. Certainly this year I'm planning to knit from my stash more. I'd like to get my stash down a little bit. I think just, you know, it seems quite likely that my health will have many more ups and downs over the next couple of years. I'm hopefully on a kind of general trend upwards, but it's not linear at all. And so I think, you know, for my own anxiety, for my own mental health, I'd like to get my stash a little bit smaller at this time in my life when that is something that makes sense, because I might not be able to knit all the time. I also kind of just want to, you know, unleash myself and knit as much as I can while I can, with the caveat that I'm really trying not to knit so much that I cause another crash. Not that that would be the worst way to, you know, if that's what causes a crash, that's better than lots of other things. So, you know, in the short term, I'm planning to knit from stash, but in general, I still do like long projects. And some of that has nothing to do with the questions that I've been talking about so far, right? Some of that has to do with, I don't know about you, but I don't love starting projects, and I don't love finishing projects. My favorite stage of any project is the middle bit, where I know what I'm knitting, I know what gauge I'm using, I know what needles I'm using, I know what size I'm knitting if I'm knitting something that comes in different sizes. I've made all of those decisions, and I'm just in the process. That is definitely my favorite stage. And so, you know, in that way, longer projects, more detailed projects, projects that work at a smaller gauge, are something that I enjoy knitting just because it gives me more of the middle bit. But I also, you know, like I want to pick things that are going to challenge me. I want to pick things that are going to, you know, require me to learn new skills and slow down for that. So I'm certainly not abandoning my old approach to knitting and picking projects. Really, I'm probably not, all of this to say, I'm probably not changing anything in the way that I knit, but I'm hoping that some of this thinking and some of this talking with you and some of the, definitely in comments in the past, some of you have made those comments where I'm like, oh, that's something I'm going to hold on to, that's something that's really going to stick with me. The way that this friend saying, maybe this is based in fear, maybe this is you trying to take knitting away from yourself before your body can take it away from you instead. Some of you have definitely made statements that have stuck with me that way. So I am not counting this conversation closed, because I'm sure that many of you will have interesting things to say. But all of this talking, I'm hoping, will change, instead of the way I knit or approach my projects, the way that I talk to myself about the projects and the way that I think about them. And hopefully, knitting doesn't really have knots, but I'd love to get into nail binding, and I'm hoping that nail binding will comprise most of the knots in my life, and I will be able to stop tying myself into knots instead. I guess a kind of final thought that well, I shouldn't say final, that's famous last words from me, but I think I should say all of those naughty bits of the naughty, K-N-O-T-T-Y, naughty bits of the conversation, I definitely believe that there's no ethical consumerism under capitalism, but I don't believe that that means we shouldn't try, right? I do believe that we should still try, get rid of my double negative there. And I think that lots of those things are self-evident, right? The way that we have these conversations, or the way that I've seen these conversations happening on the internet, isn't always super nuanced. And we can tend to go from one polarity to the other. Obviously, the middle ground is usually a better place to be, but for me, my thinking has definitely changed with this new framework of fear and what knitting, because knitting does so much for us, whether you are struggling with your health or not, and I know that many of you are. There's so much stress in the world, and I know that many of you who are not necessarily struggling with your health are struggling just in terms of the state of the world right now and the stress of what's happening, and bearing witness to it and finding ways to try to help and try to participate in community and protect the people around us and protect ourselves. None of that is self-evident, and knitting plays a big part in comforting us through those things. And I think we probably all have a bit of fear of knitting being taken away from us, or knitting contributing maybe to the problems that we're seeing in the world. And so I guess I feel like there should be some big place that I'm going with this, but I think really this has just been a bit of a small chat to share some of these ideas with you, because I'm wondering if they will resonate with you, I think, is ultimately what I'm doing here. I'm wondering if these will resonate with you, these ideas, and if that kind of hurt-hitting statement that my friend shared with me will be meaningful for you as well. And I'd love to know what you might think about all of that, because for me, I guess the ultimate change that I'm hoping to make, rather than to my practices, is to my kindness towards myself. I'm hoping to be a little nicer to myself, give myself a bit more grace, let myself off the hook a little bit more. My friend was also very insistent that when it comes to art, we do have permission to put some of those questions of consumption aside. I definitely agree with that. I think that when it comes to art and craft, it's so easy to put those questions aside when I'm thinking about other people's art or craft, or arts and crafts. Love a bit of a craft movement. I definitely find that harder to do with myself, but I guess I guess that's the point, isn't it? The point is that I need to, want to, need to get better at extending that grace to myself. So there we go. I did manage to knit a little bit. I've just finished that row, and I will leave you with a bit of footage of knitting in better light and the cats. And I hope that this has been interesting for you. Bit of a shorter one from me. I'm thinking I might do the odd video like this once in a while. I will hopefully become a bit more articulate, a bit more focused. I did have some notes, but I'm feeling a bit out of practice, a bit rusty, and a bit scatterbrained. So hopefully that wasn't too chaotic for you. But as always, I hope this video finds you well and enjoying your art, your knitting, or whatever craft or art you might be working on. And thank you again. Thank you so much for being with me.